All right, thank you. So happy to be part of this webinar, and I can see we have a participant of 143. That is very good participation. So today we are going to discuss ethics related to budgeting. And to start off is a question of ethics. Now, the basic definition of ethics that we all know is the science of what is right and what is wrong. So today we want to look at what is right and what is wrong. What are the do's and the don'ts when it comes to budgeting, and specifically related to budgeting for grants. Now, those people who are privileged, because the society thinks people who work in the NGO sector are privileged. When you say you're working in an NGO, people always think, oh, you're earning a lot of money. Oh, NGOs have a lot of money. But it's actually not really the case per se. NGOs have money, but this money is donor money. This is not their money. It is money they have been given by donors, and they're supposed to account for this money. And this money, you cannot use it for the purposes which the donor has not given you the money for, or you cannot use that money to invest in other things that you have not actually discussed or are not in line with the donor guidelines. And that makes it very important to have ethics in budgeting, especially when you're writing your grants. So what we mean by ethical budgeting, it's actually that process where you create a budget that is accurate, a budget that is transparent, and a budget that is aligned with the actual needs and objectives of the proposed research. So when you are writing grants, and today we have a bias to research, you have your objectives, you have the research questions, you have the outputs that you want to achieve, and therefore you have the activities that you have to engage in. You have to align those activities, or rather you have to align the budget to the activities. And therefore you have to be very sure that the activities that you proposed or the activities that you suggested in your proposal are actually those that are going to be budgeted for. And therefore it involves just responsibly estimating cost. So you have to estimate the cost responsibly. Of course, responsibly also you have to consider the market. You don't exaggerate the costs, and you do not as well underestimate the cost, because if you underestimate the cost, then it will become very difficult for you to deliver the projects. Maybe the cost of travel, for instance, maybe the cost of hiring conference facilities. So you have to estimate them correctly, and therefore, so that you can be able to implement your project activities. It is therefore being intentional, to ensure that the allocation of resources actually reflects on the proposed research. Next slide, please. And therefore, what guides ethical budgeting? So we have principles that you can use to guide you when you're drawing up your budgets. So one is transparency. So you have to clearly justify every line item. And this comes with a section of the budget, which Hannah is going to talk about, the budget narrative. That's why donors will ask you to have a budget narrative so that you can be able to justify all the costs. So if we are spending 100,000, so what are we going to use this 100,000? If we are traveling, what are these travels for? Now you have to also be very accuracy. You need to find out the costs that are related to the activities. So for instance, if say you're going to pay a consultant, so you have to give a reasonable range that consultants in a certain field or in a certain sector are paid. So you need to be very accurate. Accountability, you have to use the funds as intended and track expenses meticulously. So you cannot use money for activities you had not proposed. And in the event that happens, then you have to go back and consult the donor. Of course, that is not encouraged. You have to foresee this ahead of time when you're drawing your budget. You also have to align your budget with the mission. So you need to ensure that the budget items directly support project goals so that you don't have misalignment with the mission or the purpose for which the proposal has been written. Now, you also need to be compliant. You need to follow all the guidelines set by funders and institutional policies. So when funders issue the calls for proposal, they always give guidelines, and you need to be very keen to those guidelines, because those guidelines are going to guide you to the allowable cost and the disallowable costs. We're going to look at that in another slide. Next slide, please. So therefore, what are the ethical considerations in budget planning? So transparency and accountability, we've discussed, that is one of the key considerations when you're drawing your budgets ethically. Now, you also need to look at conflict of interests. So you need to disclose any personal or professional connections that might influence financial decisions. Now, for example, you have received money, or rather you're drawing your budget and you intend to use partners to help you implement the project. So maybe in a consortium, and we're going to define all these terms. So who are these consortium members? Who are these people that you're going to work with? Sometimes people have registered their own CSOs, they have registered their own small organizations, and they are working for another organization. So if you happen to be the PI or you happen to be the lead, you know that you're going to subgrant your organization that you've registered for, maybe through proxy. Now that is conflict of interest, and therefore you need to disclose. It is wrong to transfer money or to subgrant a CSO or any partner which is affiliated to you or which you have conflict in, and you fail to disclose. Then we have fair use of funds. So ensure that funds are strictly used for the project activities as proposed. We have had cases of small NGOs or even big NGOs that have been blacklisted by donors simply because they used the donor money for the wrong reasons. You could have proposed a project, and maybe in the process of implementation, you change your target participants or beneficiaries, or you feel that this category of beneficiaries are more needy than the other. Now, you cannot use donor money to respond to your emergencies. And if such has to happen, especially in the humanitarian sector, you always have to communicate to the donor, and the donor has to give a go-ahead before you can reallocate the money to other activities that were not earlier planned in the proposal. So you also need to respect donor intent. So you need to align spending with the funder's goal and restrictions. So every donor, by the time they're giving money, they have a vision, they have a goal, they have the impact that they want to see. So you should use money to help the donor achieve that impact which they actually had intended. Then managing budget changes. So you need to review the budgets and adjust accordingly as you continue implementation or you continue burning the money. So managing budget is very important because sometimes things happen, crises come in the process of implementation, and genuinely you need to readjust, genuinely you need to overspend. So this has to be communicated again to the donor. Then you also need to avoid or to prevent budget padding. So this includes avoiding inflating cost to create excess buffers. So there are people who, when they are budgeting, they inflate costs, they double costs of maybe items, procurement, and the likes. So this is something that is very unethical and should be avoided when you're doing budgeting. You also need to factor in institutional policies in determining the pay scales. So part of the budget is the pay for the people who are going to implement the project. Now, most funders usually will ask for the organizational policies regarding pay, or even maybe the pay scales. So you need to align to the policy of your organization when it comes to determining the pay scale for the staff that are going to be part of the implementation. Now, we know some donors are generous, others are a bit strict or stingy, for lack of a better word. So it is wrong to take advantage of generous donors to pay staff more than the policy actually dictates. So ethical budgeting is very key in sustaining the donor relationship, and we need to be very, very careful when we are drawing our budgets, because this is something that can really mess up the relationship between a researcher or an organization with a donor. So I will invite my colleague Hannah to proceed with the next slide, please.
Thank you, Grace, for taking us through that section. And I'll start with just asking a question so that we try and get the perception or view that we have in terms of the budgeting. Because sometimes people may hear numbers, budget, Excel sheet, and maybe they switch off. So I'll start with this question. Who prepares the budget? And I'd like to engage us in this question for you to put your answer on the chat. Who prepares the budget? In terms of just a title role, who prepares the budget? When now we are responding to a research call and we are preparing the budget. Grace, help me with the chat. I can't see the chat, maybe the responses.
I'm checking.
All right. It could be from your experience, from your belief in terms of what you think is just right, or an idea. Who do you think prepares the budget?
So I can read out the responses. So someone thinks finance manager, finance officers, a finance person, an accountant, a principal investigator, that is from Austin, the one preparing her projects, researchers and the finance officers, PI, lead consultant, the research team, and the like.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for those responses. It's good to get our ideas even as we discuss about this. So the budgeting process is very, very important. And I don't know if my slides are moving.
No, they're not.
Okay. So thank you for those responses. And we are saying that the best practice is that the budget should be prepared by the person who is designing the program. And in this case, as Austin mentioned, the principal investigator or the lead researcher in this case, or a program lead, a program manager, the program project manager, depending on the title that you use, but it is the lead researcher and the person who has overall designed the project, because this is the person who has a very good understanding of the project, is the one who has ideated the project, conceptualized, and is able to have a oversight of how the project is being steered forward. So the principal investigator, for the ones who say the finance person, the finance manager, they come in as a consultant or a support role in helping cost what has already been identified as cost items. Because in a scenario, in a typical scenario, you have the lead researcher design the concept, come up with activities, and they're able to visualize the sub activities that then the finance specialist or the finance manager will come in a supportive role to help cost. All right. So in the budgeting preparation process, it is a collaborative effort, but it is very key that the principal investigator takes charge in steering the process so that the budget also reflects the idea of the project. And when you're doing the budget, the first key step is to understand the proposal requirements. And this you do by just going through the budget requirements and looking at the allowable cost, the disallowable costs, the indirect cost rates that are stipulated by the donor. So this is a very critical step because you need to understand what the donor has put as a requirement, because different donors have different requirements, and we'll define the allowable and disallowables in the subsequent slides. But this is a critical step because it will inform how you then draft your budget. And then you need to list down the clear work packages or activities that will be involved in your project. So, for example, we are doing health project, and we have put out the work packages and sub-activities. So for example, we have a work package on maybe conducting a formative research to understand health issues in pregnant women, or if pregnant women are taking self-care during pregnancy. So if we have such a tentative activity title, we'll have sub-activities. Could involve maybe data collection, stakeholder analysis or mapping, data analysis, dissemination of the findings. So this is that very critical step. And if you now relate with what I was talking about, the person preparing the budget, you'll see now that the PI or the principal investigator clearly is well placed to define clear work packages and activities, even in terms of targets, the numbers that is in a population sample. So then this informs the finance person to be able to cost, right? So when you have done that, you also identify cost categories for the activities and then use realistic and justifiable figures. And what Grace mentioned about not exaggerating the figures, but using the realistic figures. And then from that step, you now draft the budget template. Usually, most donors will give a donor-specific template. So this step is very critical so that you don't use your own template and submit it to the donor when they have a specified template. So if you're working on a separate template, you'll be able to transfer and ensure that you have not just copy-pasted from previous budgets, but you just ensure that you're very keen to use the donor-specific template that has been set out. And then you need to prepare a budget narrative justifying each of the costs. So this is usually very important because there is the other side of the donor. You have done your budget, and from your point of understanding, it makes sense or you understand, but it's going to a third party. So you need to explain each of the costs and justify them. And then you also need to ensure that you double check for consistency and any errors. There are key components of a research budget that are very important for our understanding, even as you get the finance person to be able to support, because they're providing a supportive role. So the major overarching titles, we have the direct cost and the indirect cost, all right? So the direct costs these are costs that are directly attributed and charged to a project. So these are costs that would not exist if the project is not there. So such costs are for the planned project activities, dedicated project personnel, specific equipment for the project, and supplies used by the project. So these are what we call direct costs, and they are very key in delivering the project. And then we have the indirect costs. The indirect costs are costs that cannot be directly attributed to a particular project or program. So these costs generally include facility expenses like rent, utilities, information systems, and other supportive roles that are used to support a project like HR, accounting, M&D, and legal. So each donor has a set, or what we call, they have capped the indirect cost rate. So the indirect cost rate for different donors would be different. So for example, if you check on Wellcome indirect cost policy, it states that the total cost for overheads, it's usually used interchangeably. The overheads and the indirect costs should not be more than 20%. So they have capped it at 20%. If you go to another donor, like probably the Gates Foundation, there'll be specific indirect cost rates for specific institution. So if it's a government, they may have a government agency, it may be 0%. The universities in the US, they would say 10%, other institutions would be 15%. So depending on the donor, they'll have different indirect cost rates. And donors have capped this so that there's efficient use of resources, there's accountability, there's transparency, and there's also allocation of money to implement projects. So that is why the indirect costs are normally capped. All right. So those key things now guide even the steps that you take when you're doing the actual drafting of the budget. So when you're budgeting, the terms that we normally come across, and they're very key for our understanding so that we know what the donor expects from us. So there's an issue that there's a term that's normally used called co-financing. And co-financing is the requirement to make a financial contribution to jointly fund a project with the donor. So this is where simply the donor only funds part of the overall project budget, and it is a contractual obligation for the fund recipient to finance the remaining part of the budget. So for example, the overall project budget for, say, our health project will be 200,000 USD. And the donor has put it as a contractual obligation for you to fund maybe 50,000, and then the donor will fund 150,000. All right. So this would normally be stipulated in the call or in the grant requirements. And then there's also a term, cost sharing. Cost sharing is similar to co-financing, but typically it refers to the requirement where you're required to contribute a portion of the cost as well. But now if you look at co-financing, as the recipient, you're able to get the funding from multiple sources to co-finance the project. So even if it's in a consortium, when you're co-financing, maybe this partner would bring in this much, another partner, so that to meet the overall budget. But looking at cost sharing, it's the recipient and the donor, and the recipient typically to show just commitment and also commitment to the project. There is the commitment that you have made that you will contribute either in kind to deliver the project. So for example, if it is rent, you'd say you'll cost share the cost, and then you'll not charge the donor the cost for rent. So those are just the two major differences. The co-financing bit can have multiple contributors in terms of the recipients, and then the cost sharing would be to the donor and the recipient. Pre-financing, this is where now the advance payment of funds is made by the donor so that you're able to start activities. So it allows you to just begin the activities without having to use your own money upfront. So you realize that this is like now a liability that your organization or institution has, because when you are pre-financed, it's not income. You owe the donor. So it is very important that you realize if you're pre-financed, you have to spend so that you report to the donor. So these are like the key requirements that you need to know, because if you have been pre-financed, there's a requirement from your end to ensure that you spend and give reports so that it does not look like a liability. Only when you spend, you'll be able to look at it as income or revenue for your organization that has come in and has been spent. But before that, you owe the donor. The other key term is in-kind contribution, and these are non-cash contributions that are made to a project, such as personal time, office space, equipment, or services. Could have also donations in there. So the other one is allowable costs, And allowable costs are funds that are to be used exclusively for the budgetary process set forth in the project. So allowable costs are the costs that you were able to be approved by the donor to implement the project. So those are allowable costs. And when you're budgeting, you need to look out for costs that the donor allows to be in the budget. Otherwise, you don't want to do your draft budget and put in costs that are not allowable, yet the donor has set forth that these are the allowable costs. Disallowable costs are costs that are ineligible and cannot be charged to the project. So some of these costs include legal costs or costs that are incurred outside the contractual period. Yeah, so these are disallowable. Other donors would also put things like penalties, things like alcohol. So you need to look out for disallowable costs that are stipulated by the donor so that you're not on the wrong side of budgeting. Other key things to ensure is that your budget should match the narrative proposal. And that's why we mentioned earlier that this needs to be a collaborative effort, because imagine a scenario where, let's say, a budget talks of participants X and the narrative proposal talks about participants Y. They're not in tandem. So there should be alignment of the budget and the proposal, and also the budget narrative. So all three should be in tandem. And then you also need to consider also another very important thing when you're budgeting, and even in the as we say, the finances coming in to support, it's also key for the principal investigator to look out for these issues. So you need to factor in issues such as price increases due to inflation or exchange rate fluctuations, and budget for it. You need to budget for like an annual cost adjustment for specific activities, because you need to be able to deliver the projects well. And if you do not budget for inflation, when it is very high, you'll not be able to deliver what you promised to the donor. So most donors would allow a 3 to 5% inflation cost. So every year you need to make a provision for that in the specific activities, and then put annual cost adjustment so that it is captured. Yeah, so there are things that may not need inflation. For example, things that you just the one-time capital purchases, let's say a laptop or a vehicle. So those ones may not need the inflation planning, but now there are specific activities that you need to plan for. And then you need to also ensure that the donor indirect cost rate is adhered to. So if they have mentioned the cap is at 20, is at 15, you need to ensure you adhere to that. And then you need to understand the payment terms. I talked about this when defining the pre-financing requirement and the liabilities therein. And also one thing you need to also look out for is the budget ceiling. So normally you have a donor give probably a maximum budget. So you should not budget over what the donor has put in the guidelines. So this should be adhered to. The common ethical budget pitfalls that we normally make, because the budget is a very critical document that the donor uses to make a decision whether your project is fundable, whether they are going to fund you. And the common pitfall that people fall to is underestimating costs, and also overestimating, leading to project underfunding and potential compromises, and then also misallocation of funds, using grant money for purposes that you had not set out to. and also vague justification, just putting a sentence for the sake of it. So your justification needs to be well narrated and be very clear, because poorly documented budget items and just vague narrations is a red flag with the funder. And then the other thing is insufficient contingency planning, not accounting for unexpected costs or project delays, and this leads to financial shortfalls, and also not adhering to the funder guidelines. So these are very critical things that you need to watch out for when doing the budget. And also the ethical blind spots. So overlooking ethical considerations such as compensating staff fairly or failing to address issues of conflict of interest. So to be able to avoid these pitfalls, you need to do the budgeting process collaboratively and ensure that all the guidelines that are stipulated are adhered to. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I think I'll give it back to Bernard to moderate the other session. Thank you.